again. Thank you guys for joining us with the normal podcast. We are moving into our interview portion with the awesome Peter Clines. Peter is an author. He has done, I think this was his 7th book that's coming out today, which is called Exiles. It's on the shelf here behind me. It is part of a series called X-Heroes, in which heroes take on zombies in post-apocalyptic Los Angeles. It's an excellent series, and I highly recommend it. You guys really need to check it out, and he's here to talk to us about it.
Now, if you ever wanted to see the Avengers fight zombies with Superman, this is your series. Okay? This is right up that sort of pulpy, fun comic book alley.
That's high praise.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask you a little bit, because I heard a little bit of your interview with Kevin Veldman of the Comic Noobs podcast recently, and I always want to know a little bit about where an author came from, about what your origin was. First of all, is your inspirations, but also what was your path to this?
So this is the whole interview. This one question.
You can tell me a little bit. I don't want to overload the whole thing, but I want to know, really, because it seems to me you'll get a writer and it feels like, oh, they just popped up out of nowhere and then they have a book and everybody loves them. And I know it's never the true story.
I don't think I've ever met a single author who just came out of nowhere. You know, or like, yes, to the public in large they did, but in reality they have like this, miles of literary roadkill behind them of stuff that they wrote and screwed up and cast aside and just again and again and again. So, and I am no different. To horribly date myself, I was telling stories before this, but my first rejection letter was from Jim Shooter at Marvel Comics when he was editor-in-chief. I was 11 years old, and I submitted an X-Men script to Marvel.
I had to be 18 before I got my first rejection letter, so like you definitely had me beat there.
Well, it was really cool because I had no clue what I was doing. I just wanted to tell a story, and I thought it'd be cool. And Shooter actually sent me back this like very personal, actually very polite and professional letter, as if I was some freelancer he dealt with before who'd pitched him something, and not just some stupid kid who hadn't even hit puberty yet. So
it seems like there's a lot of stories like that from back in that era, because you have, I remember reading way back, some of my classic science fiction authors that was sort of my influence coming up, is science fiction short stories. And I remember reading a lot of them where they would send in these crappy drafts to these editors at these big sci-fi magazines, and they would get back an actual response, which that seems so alien to the world today, where, and I understand why, because we have the writers arena where we get people submitting stuff, and you just, when you have even a small number of submissions and you have other work that you have to do, to take the time to write a letter to encourage someone who's just getting started out like that it's amazing.
It's huge. Yeah, and then, honestly, one of the reasons I'm a diehard Marvel guy is because the people at Marvel were so cool to me as an up-and-coming writer that, I got Jim Shooter basically encouraged me, whether he meant to or not, and I probably sent him like another 5 or 6 things, all of which got polite rejections, and then after he left and Tom DeFalco took over, I sent another thing in, and Tom DeFalco sent me back this huge packet, which I've still got stashed away, with like the Marvel Writer's Bible, a how-to, his original script for an issue of Thor that had just come out, which was I know I'll get the actual name wrong. It's the Once in Future Thor story. It was really famous, with like the kid in the future who finds Thor's hammer and becomes like future Thor.
But I gotta say, I'm not the biggest comic guy, so I don't know the reference personally.
So a lot of people listening know it. Trust me.
Okay.
But yeah, they all sent me this stuff and just encouraged me, and like I said, I started out at telling stories as far back as I can remember. My earliest memories are telling stories to people, and I know that sounds stupid and trite and some writer thing to say, but it's just the truth. I can remember being like, Sorry?
I was just gonna say it's even in your bio. Like, what was it? Like, Lizard Men from the Center of the Earth was one of the first things you ever wrote, and you were a kid for that.
Which is the honest to God truth. I was in third grade. I can still remember it at York Elementary School in Maine, and I took a big stack of that like double-lined yellow paper that they give you, so you can where to put your lowercase in capitals.
Right.
I probably filled out, like a ungodly amount, like 15 pages of that, which probably, if you added it up, was like 300 words, maybe. But
Lizardman from the Center of the Earth sounds rad, by the way. I'm new to this series, by the way. Your publisher sent me the first copy of the book, but do the Lizardmen from the Center of the Earth show up in X Heroes? Because that's really, I'm excited, more excited than I was for the rest of these books that there are Lizardmen from the Center of the Earth.
I actually finally got to do a Lizardman story for a time travel anthology.
That's awesome.
a couple of years ago at this point, called Times of Trouble, which was just loads of fun that I finally got to do it. That the editor pitched, like, oh, do you want to do this? Because basically they wanted to do a whole anthology of nothing but time travel stories where things go horribly wrong.
Well, that's all of them, isn't it? There's never a time travel story where somebody gets a flower and brings it back to their wife and they're happy and dinner gets cooked.
So I wrote this whole story about essentially a group of cops here in Los Angeles who find a lizard man in the subways, and they don't know what to do, and they actually get this one unflappable guy named Mulligan, who is like one of their tough homicide cops, to interview him, because they're like, well, it talks, and we don't know what to do. And so Mulligan starts talking to the lizard man, and the lizard man, because he's like, so you're a lizard man. Where are you from? Well, I'm from Los Angeles. So you live under the city? No, I have an apartment. I live here. And finally, he's like, so what? I don't understand what's going on. All right, look, I'm a theoretical physicist, and I built a time machine, and I went way back, and I screwed something up. And now I'm here again in the present, and everything's wrong.
So our timeline is the messed up one.
Yes.
Looking at what is up with these dumb, stupid ape things?
And so
where's my wife that was a lizard?
This lizard man who wants to change things back to the way they're supposed to be.
That's fascinating. I don't think I've ever heard that exact take of our timeline being the wrong one. I'm sure there's something like that in sci-fi, but that's actually a really cool sci-fi idea.
Thank you.
I like hearing that you're still getting some time to write some short fiction in there. That's something that gets overlooked so much these days. Like at the end of Expatriates, especially on the Audible version, you had a short story there that was set in the same world as X-Heroes, but it was local and it wasn't focused on the heroes. I love seeing that sort of stuff from major authors because it's so rare we actually get to see short stories from anybody like that anymore.
Actually, that story on the Audible isn't set in the world of X-Heroes. It's what happened. That was a weird little thing. Back, I used to be with I still have a couple of books with a smaller press called Permuted, and that's where the X-Heroes series started out, and it's since moved to Random House. But when Permuted made a deal with Audible.com, and one of the things Audible wanted to do was do like I think it was 2011 was their Summer of Zombies, and they wanted to do all this bonus material, and they contacted Jacob Kier, who was the publisher of Permuted at the time, and said, do you know any author who could do bonus material for us? And he suggested me. And the whole catch was we want to put like these separate stories that we can tag onto a bunch of audiobooks, but they have to be connected, but it can't matter what order you read them in. And like each one they have to be connected, but they each have to be standalone. And the order can't matter, and like
sounds like cable or regular network television.
Yeah, and
it's like they're in the same universe, but order doesn't matter. Just put them up there.
And to be terribly honest, I just desperately needed the money at the time, so I said, sure, I can do that. Having no idea what I was going to do or anything, and the idea that I finally got hit with was, what if I had like a Rashomon zombie story that was the same 2 days being seen from multiple people's points of view? So I think the one, if you read that, would have been the one about the woman traveling across the city, was the one that came with Expatriates.
Yeah, though she was traveling across the city and she kept running into she kept having the same thing happen to her with her travelers.
Yes, not to give anything away, but the basically all the other people that she randomly runs into, we see all the events from that story from different points of view in the other stories. That we see at one point, there's like a sniper who randomly kills one of the junkies she's dealing with. At another time, they run into another pack of survivors. There's a guy she runs into at the end of it, and the other stories are all these people, and all of whom believe they're the hero of the story. So,
well, it's definitely an interesting take on collaborative storytelling. It sounds like it would definitely have some challenges, though.
I have no idea how I pulled it off. I did the whole thing in 4 weeks, all 4 stories, and Audible was really happy with it. They've actually bound the whole thing together. It's called The Junkie Quatrain, and you can find it. I think it's only in ebook and Audible because it was too small to do anything actual print-wise with.
So where did the inspiration for your X-Heroes book come from? Which is, I mean, I'm sure you've gotten that question a lot. And it seems like, to be honest, I will say this, it seems like the kind of idea that should have been done before 2010. I mean, we're all sick of zombies. Not sick, but zombies have been done a lot. And superheroes are big and have been for a good number of years, to the point where we're predicting the death of a superhero movie for quite a while. So how are you the guy who is like, these two pieces could go together?
Well, I'm not really the guy. I mean, a lot of people did it before me. Both of the major companies had big superhero versus zombie series back in like 2006, 2007. Hell, I think I remember, again, for the comic folks listening, I think John Byrne did like one of his first issues of Action Comics when he took over in the 80s was Superman and the Phantom Stranger fighting zombies. And that was, coming up 30 years ago now, so...
I guess I'm thinking in the novel world more than the comic world, but it's not like they're separate, really separate. Yeah. I mean, they're all books, stories.
I think part of it is that overall superheroes, I don't think a lot of people think they translate well to novels. It is really tough. There are some good, there's a lot of successful superpowers stories, I guess we could say, about people who have superpowers. You look at Firestarter, the Dead Zone, things like that. It's people, Jumper, people who have special abilities, but they're not necessarily superheroes. And so that's probably the big part of it. I mean, as far as the inspiration goes, one of those superhero books, one of those big comic book things we were just talking about, I saw it advertised ahead of time, and it was like, oh, we're going to do like this huge Romero-style zombie story. And I thought that was really cool, but when it finally came out, it just didn't really live up to it for me. I'd sort of pictured a lot more things that could be happening with, superheroes fighting zombies. It just seemed like there was a lot of potential there that got overlooked. I know the series was like super powerful with the people who liked it, and a lot of people liked it. They made a ton of money, so I can't really, call them wrong. But I sat down and scribbled out a bunch of notes to myself of just like, I would have done this with this character, that with that character, and, that sort of thing. And then a couple months later, my girlfriend and I, unconnected, just happened to move in together. And I finally had an office where I could put up all my crap that I've been lugging around in boxes since I moved to California. And one of the things I found was an old an old sketch pad that had a bunch of superheroes I made up when I was little, and submitting things to random comic book companies and stuff. And I realized all these characters I'd made up when I was a kid, like St. George, like the Driver, like Cerberus, like Gorgon, they were all sort of basic superhero archetypes that would work really well with I could basically slot them into that story I wanted to tell.
Is it tricky balancing out the power, because there are characters like St. George, who is basically invincible. Zap is almost completely beyond anything physical. So some of these characters, I mean, Cerebus, the idea of being trapped in that suit was, I think, one of the things that really spoke to me of her, and I kind of wanted to see more of that in the book. It was just sort of mentioned offhand, like she was trapped at one point, but I thought, like, holy crap, this sort of giant 10-foot tall power armor thing running out of power and being stuck in the middle of zombies, that's an awesome idea. But with some of these other more powerful characters, is it tricky making the zombies weak enough or the heroes weak enough, or, I'm sorry, the zombies powerful enough so that there's not just an easy solution? Like, why don't they just run through everything?
It is, yeah. I mean, I actually addressed that in the second book. Part of it is just numbers. That it's easy to say, yes, just run through everything, blah, blah, blah. But I broke the numbers down that if you say there's 5 million zombies in Los Angeles, and I actually had one of the characters breaks the numbers down for someone who's in the second book. They run into the military, and the military is like, "Well, why haven't you done more?" And they're like,
they had cleared out like areas like Yuma or something like that, where it's only 100,000 people.
And basically, one of the heroes' stealth sort of breaks it down. Like, if we'd been killing 100 zombies a day every single day since this happened, we would not have even taken out 1% of the zombies in Los Angeles. And
that's just Los Angeles.
And that's just Los Angeles. And they're like, we've got better things to do. We're trying to keep 5,000 people alive. That's part of it, just the raw numbers. The other thing is, kind of like you said, the overpowering thing, trying to show, I guess, a slightly more realistic version of being uber powerful. One of the things with Zap is he is, this massively energetic, depending on, the exact interpretation, either like a contained nuclear explosion in human form. But at the same time, he's only in human form because he's controlling it. And so anything that breaks his concentration, that makes, basically he has to control all of it. And yes, it would be easy for him to shoot a blast of energy that takes out a bunch of heroes. Also, that could burn a hole straight through the center of the earth. So he has to actually be careful when he goes out trying to deal with zombies. And also, one of the ideas I tried to hint at earlier is Zap is actually based off a really silly idea I came up with when I was younger. Basically just off the whole classic Einstein energy mass thing. That what if you actually converted a 180-pound person into pure energy? How much energy would that be? The catch to that is all the energy he burns off is mass he's losing when he changes back. So he goes out and throws a couple huge energy bolts, and he just lost 5 pounds. And he burns 500 X's to ash, and he just lost 10 pounds. And there quickly hits a point where it's actually dangerous for him to do too much. So.
Oh, he's already, like, in his human form, he's also debilitated that way, so he could cause any number of complications there, too.
Exactly. I actually at one point played with the idea, which I then discarded because I just thought it started getting too weird, that he was in the wheelchair because of the fact that he was Zap.
He'd used too much one time and lost spinal matter or something?
Or something like that he wasn't able to just put himself together again quite right. But it just seemed like a little extra. And honestly, I just like the idea of what if he was just always in a wheelchair? He was just a guy who's in a wheelchair for some reason. And and he got superpowers. I thought it was a lot more interesting to just have a guy who, these are my choices in life. I can be in a wheelchair, or I can fly, but I can't touch anything.
I like that idea too. That's something that I kind of wish there was more of in superheroes. I know we have Dr. X, and he's in the wheelchair, but his power is mental stuff. But I almost wish there were more unconventional. Like a guy who's actually blind, not like Daredevil, like he actually can't see stuff, but he has a power, or someone who's confined to a wheelchair, but they're super strong, or, and so where the two things are melded. And I wish that there was more of that in the superhero world. And it's kind of cool to see you bring something like that into a character like Zap, where he has to make that choice. He's constantly torn between two forms that both have severe disadvantages. One is powerful but can't connect, and the other one is weak but can speak with, connect with his fellow people, humans.
Yeah.
And it also sucks because for him, like, whatever he's in that form, a lot of the times he's just sitting in a chair providing power for everybody else, so he's kind of confined even in the super form.
Yeah.
I think
Which
that's
I'm trying to. Yep, and third book and so on.
Yeah. I've read further than Al has, so I was just refreshing him on that.
Okay. I also wanted to ask. I'm sorry. Did you have a question, Tony? Because I'm just hogging the questions. Well, okay. So you mentioned at the beginning of this book, I think it's in St. George's origin story. First of all, it's almost hilarious how he turns. He's got he's working in a top secret lab that also gets hit by a radioactive meteorite and something else happens. And it's just like throw the kitchen sink of comic book changing into hero things at this one character.
One of the things that I've had great fun with, and most people have, is that I love the fact that every character in the series basically just has a comic book origin. All of them. That they get their powers from weird blood transfusions, or, yes, a meteor strike. Or in the second book, one of the other characters, the driver, actually explains that he got his powers because he was struck by lightning when he was working on a car. And St. George tries to argue, but that won't give you superpowers. Yeah, but it did. But it can't. But it did.
I have this wish, and I have no idea what your plan is, but I'm going to pitch this to you right now. Because all of these superhero universes, they have a start point where you have superheroes get superpowers, where before we didn't have them, right? Like, there was no Superman in the 1850s. It's just some people. And then somewhere around 1930, we start getting superheroes, and it turns into this big thing, and it keeps getting updated because they keep making comics, and they're not going to get rid of the old ones, so they just have their origin moved up and up and up in time. But I think it would be neat if you had everybody have this origin happen around the same time, and then you had an explanation, like maybe there was some kind of supervillain who had unleashed these powers on the world, the ability to get these powers because of some greater machinations he was working. That's an idea that I have.
I have played with the idea of doing something like that, a prequel, because a lot of people have asked, like, well, okay, so you've talked about all this, why did all these heroes show up at the same time? But honestly, in one level it sounds like it'd be really cool. On another level, how really interesting was it to find out how Anakin Skywalker became Darth Vader?
I was going to shift over to 14 for a little bit because that's actually what got me into your writing. I saw it on an Audible Daily Deal and just decided to jump on it. Sounded horror, sounded kind of Lovecrafty, like cosmic horror. And I have to say, like, out of all the cosmic horror that I've read in the past few years, that one nailed it more than any other. Like, before that, my favorite cosmic horror was probably It, followed by a bunch of actual Lovecraft stuff. But that was a really great book. And I heard you talking to Kevin about how, like, that was a smaller one that's just kind of built up over time. And it's really cool to see a book actually expand like that. So I guess what I'm asking, like, the idea for a kind of a creepy apartment building in Los Angeles, is that something where you were just like living somewhere and you decided to like put that out there? Did you always run around cosmic horror? Like, what spawned that?
That was a bunch of different things. Part of it on one level was it was like 2 or 3 little threads I'd had for different ideas that were floating around. The other thing actually did tie to an apartment that I was living in when I first moved to Los Angeles. There were 2 major elements to this apartment. One was the fact that I had lived there for about, I don't know, a year, I think, maybe a little less than a year. And it struck me that I didn't know any of my neighbors. And this struck me as really kind of odd. And when you think about it, that most apartment buildings really are just like college dorms for adults. And when you're in college, you know every one of your neighbors. You hang out with them, you eat with them, you fool around with them, you do everything. But the more I thought about it, it's like, most apartment buildings I've ever lived in, I don't know most of the people in my building. I don't know most of the people in the building I'm in now. You have like that sort of passing familiarity with them. You bump into them at the grocery store, you kind of half recognize them. But it struck me as just very odd that, nobody in this building really knew each other or talked. And what actually happened, the big moment, was back in 2000. want to say 2007, I think it was, might have been 2006. There was a huge fire in Griffith Park here in Los Angeles, and it almost burned down the Griffith Park Observatory. There was like major talk that it could get loose in the city, and my neighbors and I all ended up on the roof of the building just drinking beer and watching the fire. The manager came up at one point and was like, you're not all supposed to be up here, right? We're like, yeah. And he's like, all right, just needed to say that. That's all. And then he came over and got a beer, and we all... and from that point on, like, suddenly we'd become this little community, and now people were talking and, just sort of hanging out, sharing DVDs, movies, talking in the hall, that sort of stuff. So that idea of community really struck me. The whole idea that you could have this little self-contained community, which is on one level very much what 14 is about. The other thing was when I was moving out of the building to get this apartment with my girlfriend, we were cleaning out. We were in that stage of, whenever you move, you invariably end up with that point where, like, okay, like 95% of your stuff is gone, and now there's just like these random things, like 3 good-sized boxes worth just scattered all over the apartment. Like, and you're not really sure, like, how did I forget that shirt and those 4 books, and it's all that random stuff. And while we were packing up and cleaning up, I think my girlfriend made this joke about how we should like leave a note for the next person who moves into the apartment. And then I laughingly, of course, took it too far and said, what we should really do is like mash up some note and shove it in the back of one of the drawers about how, like, this is your last chance, get the money to us by tonight or you're a dead man.
That definitely sounds like something I would do. I used to go around and put like really weird sticky notes on things, like like just on a mirror I'd put, you should really wash your hands now, or something like that. Weird little things to creep
public service announcement.
There were more creepy ones, but I don't want to implicate myself.
But that's what this became, was I really started thinking, we joked about doing that, and then I just started thinking more and more about, like, hell, you don't know what happened in your apartment before you lived there. Any apartment any of us have, there could have been families in it, there could have been single people, there could have been murders, people could have shot porn, there could have been suicides. You just don't know what happened in your apartment before you lived there. And eventually at one point, the two ideas, that idea of community and the idea of what if weird things had happened in your apartment. And then at one point I sort of had the switch flipped of, well, what if weird things had happened in every apartment? And it wasn't until people started talking to each other that, if something weird happens in your apartment, you just kind of write it off as, I got like this one weird light fixture. And if something weird happens in my apartment, I'm like, it looks like somebody wrote all over the walls at one point and they painted over it. But it's not until suddenly you start talking and I start talking and she starts talking, he starts talking, and you suddenly start to see this whole pattern of weird stuff in everyone's apartment. And pretty much that was it. I just had that rough idea, and part of it was just thinking, like, okay, now it would be like the weirdest thing to happen. Like Gabby had. And some of it I scaled back on, and some of it I didn't. And it just kept building and building. And it's actually, to this day, it's the fastest book I ever wrote. I wrote the first draft of 14, I think, in 6 weeks. And
wow. That's good.
At the time, it was actually bigger than the final book. I had to cut about 20,000 words out of the final version. So
that's impressive. I have not got to read that one yet, but it is the one I'm maybe most interested in. I read the one they sent me because I know you got the launch of Exile this week, today actually, when we're recording this. I'm desperately interested in reading 14 in a few weeks. I'm going to read something else. I'm working on something else right now, but 14 is on my list to be read because, first of all, I was just excited when I read the description, and now that you've said all that, I'm pumped up. I want to read that.
I've always been surprised how well it's been received, because when it came out, I'd only had 3 books come out, and one of them had bombed utterly, and the other 2, which were actually the first 2 X-Heroes books, had done like okay to moderately well. The truth is, when X-Heroes first came out, the original publishing was back in 2010, and it didn't do that great. You know, it was for a small press book, it did fine, but I mean, it wasn't like I was going to be quitting my day job at any point, even though I had already quit my day job. And then I actually did a mashup novel, which completely bombed. I joke about the fact that to this day, 6 years later, it still hasn't earned back its advance, which was really, really small. I've actually been paid more for short stories than I got for an advance on this novel. And it still hasn't earned it back. But the publisher's actually putting out a nice big new edition next month, which looks really gorgeous, to be honest.
Which book was that?
That was The Eerie Adventures of the Lycanthrope Robinson Crusoe. The basic idea was the former publisher of Permuted and I were bouncing ideas off each other. There were like 2 or 3 other people around, and the mashups were the big thing at the time, you know, as was the style at the time, and
right, versions and zombies and all that jazz.
Right, all of those. So the publisher wanted to try and do some mashup novels. Just let's get on this cash, gravy train while it's going, and we all bounced different ideas around, and somehow I ended up with Robinson Crusoe and werewolves, which was kind of cool because we pitched like a Robinson Crusoe versus zombies and all that. I think I somehow ended up on werewolves, and part of it for me was that I was willing to do a mashup, but I didn't want to do nothing against them. I didn't want to do a goofy, tongue-in-cheek mashup. I really wanted this to be a serious, what if Daniel Defoe had written a horror novel sort of thing. And so the idea I came up with was, what if, Crusoe is a werewolf, and getting stranded on this island is actually the best thing that could happen to him, because now he can't hurt anybody. He doesn't have to worry about being identified, being seen. And then at some point, while I was roughly plotting it out and pitching it, things took this creepy Lovecraftian twist, and I thought, well, wait a minute though. What if at first he's happy and then discovers he's on the absolutely worst island you could ever be shipwrecked on? And
you have me intrigued. How did this bomb?
It bombed because one of the big things, again, because I tried to take it seriously, I actually copied Daniel Defoe's writing style. I learned like a lot of terminology, everything, the spelling, the way he did stuff. And I wrote an early 18th century horror novel. And then what I discovered was I had written an early 18th century horror novel, and there's not a huge market for those.
Now I'm even more intrigued.
So, but, next month.
This is a little tangent. Okay, sorry. I want to say something related to that, but
shoot.
Anyway. Well, this is not about your book, so I don't want to get too far away, but one of my favorite series that I've discovered recently is from a guy I really like, G. Wells Taylor. He has a mashup series called Dracula of the Apes, which is Dracula mashed up with Tarzan of the Apes, done completely seriously with the style of what's his name? Edgar Rice Burroughs. And it worked really well for me, and now I'm excited for Robinson Crusoe. Your Adventures of the Lycanthrope Robinson Crusoe? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. I want to read that. Is that on Kindle? Can I get that on Kindle?
I think you can get it on Kindle now, and the new edition comes out next month sometime.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, so I had that come out and it bombed. Expatriates came out and it did slightly better and kind of raised X-Heroes because of it. And I had actually wanted to do kind of like a Zombies in Space book after that. And the publisher actually told me, he's like, I actually just bought a Zombies in Space novel. He's like, so I don't really want to buy another one. I was like, oh. Well, I had this idea about a creepy apartment building. What if I wrote that? He's like, oh, okay, that sounds good. And really, when I was writing it, I loved it. But I honestly believed it was just going to be one of those books that again, nobody else was going to be interested in. That I'd find out that I'm just going to be the zombie superhero guy, and that's going to be my whole career.
That does suck when that happens, by the way. I hate when, it's great when an author's good at something, but it's nice if you can sort of branch out and do more than one thing and not be stuck like Arthur Conan Doyle with Sherlock Holmes. Be like,
Or
God, I gotta write another one of these.
honestly, I wrote for a film magazine for a while, and I got to interview George Romero twice. And one of the things that he brought up was that he loves zombie movies, but he'd like to do other things. But all he can get funding for is zombie movies. If he goes to them and says, "Oh, well, I had this idea. What if I did like a supernatural thriller about, this?" No, George, why don't you do another zombie movie? Well, okay, but I also had like this dramatic thing about, people who do Ren Fair stuff on motorcycles. And no, why don't you stick to the zombie movies, George? And so yeah, I was having that worry, and 14 came out and just immediately started getting good reviews, and it just kept building and building and building. And the audiobook, I think, took off. I lucked out that the guy who reads the audiobook, Ray Porter, also reads a lot of books for Jonathan Maberry. And so we had kind of a crossover thing there happen, and it just went crazy. And to be terribly honest, I love to sort of spring this on people because it got announced a while ago, but I think it didn't really spread. I found out last summer that one of the people who's a big fan of it is Robert Downey Jr.
That's quite a fan to have.
That is. In fact, he's such a fan, he bought the rights to it. And we start shooting a pilot for the television series in a month or so.
Man, I would definitely watch that. I could see it being like the perfect 10-episode seasons for something like that. I don't know how many seasons you could get out of it, but you could definitely get some good stuff.
Fingers crossed then. We'll all it's still it's Hollywood, so it is still the huge chain of ifs. If the pilot goes over well, if a studio wants to pick it up, if a network picks it up, if they can sign all the actors they like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But honestly, just the idea of it is still kind of exciting to me.
It's very exciting. I'm excited. That sounds awesome. Now I really got to read the book. Also, Exiles, by the way, that's coming out here. But really, I'm pumped about 14 and Strummon's and Chris the Werewolf. Well, anyway. I think that'll about wrap us up. Tony, did you have any last questions, or?
I think we covered. I think we covered most everything that I had written down. So.
Okay.
Did you have closing thoughts?
Me?
Peter? Yes, you. I was going to call you Eric for some reason. I think I might have called you Eric at some point in this podcast, so now I don't know where my brain went.
Sorry.
Right now, I've got to be honest. I've been going through most of this podcast staring at Tony's Pip-Boy there behind him.
Oh, yeah?
Oh, yeah?
I should have had it turned on.
I've been trying to look into the camera so that it doesn't look weird because I'm down looking at my laptop. Whereas
I do, too. I know that always looks weird when people start looking at other stuff on the screen, but it's a friend of mine got one of those, too, and I'm just jealous. I'm a Fallout fan from way back when, so. Yeah,
I got an offer to basically double the cost of what I bought that Fallout set for, or the extended edition. It was $120 and someone offered me $240 for it, and I was really tempted, but I've got Fallout tattoos and things like that, so I could not have the Pip-Boy. I had to keep that.